What's up, everyone? Welcome to The Heroic Ethic. I'm your host, Liberty Bill, and with me today I have a guest, Shand, because we're going to have a discussion. All I know about Shand is that he identifies as a Libertarian Socialist and has made the claim after watching my videos that I've gotten a few things wrong, maybe misrepresented a perspective or two, and wanted to hash it out, and so was kind enough to do so, on video, and I'm going to put it on the channel, and we'll see how it works, if people like it or not. If so, maybe we can do a series of interviews and such. So, I'm Liberty Bill. This is Shand. Shand, why don't you take it away and tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from and all of that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Shand. I do they, them pronouns. I call myself a Libertarian Socialist. I guess if you want, you could call me like an anarcho-syndicalist. You could call me all sorts of things. I just sort of do the umbrella term. I'm not particularly married to any specific. I just have the general, the general, I guess if you want to call them like axiomatic views that I think liberty is helpful to human happiness, and I'm a socialist. I like workplace democracy, all that kind of stuff. I have a degree in philosophy. Very, very cool. I'm a philosophy major. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, as a little aside, I call myself a philosopher, but I am autodidactic and untrained. My degree is in economics, so a little bit of overlap, but not much.
Absolutely.
So this is going to be fantastic. I love talking to trained philosophers who, know who made what arguments and can even educate me a lot in that degree. Because as someone with a philosophy degree, I'm sure you've studied many philosophers that I've never even heard of. So awesome. Please continue.
Yeah, I'm currently doing a semester with classes like advanced social and political philosophy. So it's nice and relevant to this conversation. Yeah, absolutely. So as I understand it, you've called yourself a libertarian. For the purposes of this discussion, we'll say you're a right libertarian, I'm a left libertarian, you're a capitalist libertarian, I'm a socialist libertarian for that.
I'm with you as far as like the specificity of labels, because there's just so many different flavors and it's hard to necessarily pin down an individual. But for me, if you were to say I'm an anarcho-capitalist, I would say, well, technically you're wrong, but my view does probably rhyme with anarcho-capitalism more often than other, certainly more than syndicalism or libertarian socialism. So yeah, in very broad general strokes, this is like anarcho-capitalist and anarcho-socialist, right? Even though that doesn't describe you, that doesn't describe me, but just in general terms.
Yeah, if you want to get into the specifics, I'm not sure that an anarchist system could work immediately, whereas, as I understand it, the pure anarchist position is to say, let's go. We have the revolution, we go into anarchism, that's it. Whereas I'm a little skeptical on that front.
Right. The whole term anarchist is so problematic, because I have to give it to you guys. You had the term first, and it's so annoying to me that, like...
Hey, we had the term libertarian first, too. Libertarian was originally used by a left libertarian to describe his positions. And then it kind of got appropriated to the right libertarian side.
It's annoying. I hate it when you have those, weird overlaps, especially when you don't define your terms at the beginning, because then it just gets so confusing. And yeah, on my side, I'm like, guys, come up with a different term. Like, why are you doing this? Because I hate, I criticize newspeak, just generally speaking, and especially, in a political sense. So it's annoying that my side has this little hypocritical quirk to it. So anyway.
And I mean, from my perspective, at least, all terms are made up. And if it's made up in a way that accurately describes a type of human belief in terms of politics, if everyone agrees on it and uses it, it's probably fine.
Exactly. And I hate getting caught up on terms and labels and how often that discussion will get sidetracked because, that's not what fascism means, or that's not what capitalism means, or,
Well, fascism, I will say, just fascism is especially difficult to define because it wasn't academically defined. Like right libertarianism, left libertarianism, capitalism, socialism, all these things have pretty strong academic groundings, whereas fascism was kind of like street invented.
Yeah, that's my main problem with it, is because I have an economics degree, and so I come to it as, tend to think of it as a purely economic term to describe just, a means of order of the, or a way to order the means of production. And so then it's just annoying for me if I let slip, if I'm talking about a purely capitalist versus a purely fascist system, then people will be like, oh, but there's no nationalism or jackboots or, concentration camps. That's not fascism. And I'm like, I shouldn't have said that. I should have said something else.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, fascism is almost purely social cultural, especially because you see something like the recent rise in Nazbolism, which is National Bolshevism. It's basically fascism, socialism, if you want to do that combination. So it's economic socialism, supposedly.
Which is annoying to me, because if you're talking about economic systems, there is like a space for which, to me, fascism perfectly fits, when there's private ownership of the means of production, but there's total government control of it. So, it's not like ownership in the normal sense. And if you don't call it fascism, because everybody adds on these political socio connotations, which you just yourself admitted that you kind of think of it that way, it makes it very problematic for someone like me, because I do want to refer to that economic system at times, but it is fascism technically. So there's really no good term to use it in an economic sense. I guess corporatist might be probably the very best way, but it gets very confusing. So anyway.
Maybe just to make this discussion easier, we can delineate between your economic fascism and the sort of social fascism, which
are we even going to go into fascism? I was just using it as an example.
I'm here to discuss whatever you want. I don't know if fascism will be relevant to the discussion, but just in general, I want to kind of nip any semantic arguments in the bud. We can just say, these are definitions we use.
Well, I'm pretty hypersensitive to differences of a definition. It tends to come out in dialectics, so I will try and
sure, absolutely.
keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. So if you want to get into my specific objections, I guess the main two. There's the general,
and this, by the way, is I put out a few videos talking about my epistemology. I've said a few bad things about moral relativity and nihilism and such. And so this is the context by which Shand here is saying I'm wrong. So, and we haven't done any kind of prep for this, so I'm very curious to hear, why I'm wrong. So hit me up, bro.
So I guess my primary thing is the conflation of postmodernism and Marxism through your Romanticism definition. I'd love to talk more about that.
Okay. It's a very broad term, a lot of different...
Yeah, it is I would say, too broad a term to describe things that are kind of at odds with each other. I would say Marxism is a modernist theory, so postmodernism.
Okay, well, so to that, let me just briefly say that, one, I get that it's super broad, but there's a method to my madness here, because two, this is a YouTube channel. I don't want to be super polarizing and give people the impression that I'm on one side or the other, because that just immediately brings all of this bias to the table. And so I'm trying to use terms that aren't charged. And to me, rationalism versus romanticism is a good way of doing that, because romanticism, while it is broad, it does kind of encompass the main points of the views that I oppose, and it does so in a way that isn't, I hope, immediately going to, be tribal, if you know what I mean. So
yeah, it depends. I would love to hear sort of your specific stuff on how those two fit together, specifically postmodernism and Marxism. Because when I saw them being in the same category, my immediate first thought was that Jordan Peterson postmodern neo-Marxist label that gets kind of confusing.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Oh, well, that's on me then. But there's a conflation I see between the two terms that I would argue is kind of hard to show between the two. As for general stuff, from our discussion, you're more of a right libertarian, anarcho-capitalist-esque. I'm a left libertarian, anarcho, I guess, syndicalist-esque. So just a general discussion. I assume we
like
share
a
the
Noam
same
Chomsky type.
What?
Like a Noam Chomsky type?
Yeah, around there. A Noam Chomsky, Richard Wolfe, that kind of thing.
I respect Chomsky a lot. He's a rationalist. He believes in the moral structure of mind, which is a main component of my own philosophy. So Props to Chomsky. Don't agree with that.
Yeah, no, he's a cool dude. He's a cool dude. I really appreciate him. Big fan. And so just general, I assume we have the same values in terms of thinking that liberty is cool, thinking that individuality are cool. So discussing, which economic system better facilitates those would be a good debate topic. I think those are the...
Economics is how I came to this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And see, I did the other way around. I had the social and the social values first, and then from that came to the economic system that I thought better encapsulates those values.
And honestly, I think that is one of the main differences between the ANCAP versus ANSOC factions, is which one you came to at first. Because absolutely all of my views on liberty and such are informed through my economic understanding, which largely is about, well, this system just doesn't work over time. So
yeah, and it's a genuine contention. I would argue that that any economic position, if not completely arbitrary, has to come from some kind of moral value. You have to have some reason why you prefer it that isn't just like, oh, I like this one. And inevitably that kind of reason will come down to, you think this better encapsulates certain values, whether that be, economic efficiency, if you value that morally, or, if you think it leads to equality or freedom or whatever.
This is where I need to talk a little bit about praxeology, because what you said is something I strongly disagree with, which was that values are embedded in this sort of analysis, whereas praxeology ascribes to what's called a wertfree, and I'm not fucking German, so I presume I butchered that, a value-free type of analysis, where we just take as a fact that humans do pursue their subjective utility to increase it with every action, but that we can't presume to know what those are. Like, that's where utilitarianism really goes awry, where they presume that you can create these interpersonal comparisons of utility. And Mises's praxeology approach, which I endorse and use in my channel, says that we can't do that. And so that's why it's very important to keep things and analyze in a sense that's value free, where we're just looking at the fact that people make subjective choices to increase their utility, but that we can't measure it. So just a little aside there.
Well, how do you measure the success of a system if not by how much people approve of it, and by how much people approve of it, therefore by how much they enjoy it, how much utility they're getting out of it?
Because we're confronted with the fact that interpersonal comparisons of utility are 100% necessary, and the fact that they're unmeasurable is very problematic, but we do need to make certain calls. And this is complicated by the fact that people will lie about their subjective utility if it gains them an advantage. So, at the extreme, and this is a silly example to illustrate it, but if, the fact that you might bump into me one day, that is, an overall reduction of my subjective utility. But to alleviate that, I would have to imprison you in your basement, right? Mm-hmm. And so I could lie and say, oh gosh, no, just this, the thought, it haunts me, it ruins me, it's so debilitating, I lose so much utility that it's just so much more than he would lose if he were imprisoned in his basement. So imprison that dude, because I say so. We can't go by people's words in that respect, right? And so that's why law is about arbitrators saying no, that's ridiculous, because we're employing human understanding here. But in terms of my philosophy, it's you've got to make certain calls that will generate general principles, and so they have to be super freaking obvious, like the one that I just gave you, and that's how we are able to derive the axioms that underlie the anarcho-capitalist position, which are based strongly on property rights, right? So for people that are not aware, the main theoretical differentiation between left libertarianism and right libertarianism, or ANCAP versus ANSOC, is property rights, right? For ANCAP, that's the core of everything, and that can only in certain circumstances be overwhelmed. But for socialists, it's much more facile. Property rights is something that's on the table, and actually most of their preferred systems, marginalize property rights. And so that's like the main bone of contention, as I see it. Let me know if I
Yeah,
get it.
it depends on how you define property. I assume you're using this in the private sense to mean something you own and is somehow backed up by violence.
Yes, not quite. Okay, so here for the sake of viewers, we have to differentiate again. I use private property in a broader sense than those on the left do. They differentiate between private property and personal property, right? And personal property is something that you use, so like your toothbrush and stuff, and nobody's going.
Toothbrushes will not be taken under socialism. Yeah.
Yeah, no, they're talking about like the means of production, about capital, about factories, about nets, about tools, about all of that stuff. They're differentiating there, and so that's where he's calling me out. When I say private property, I actually do tend to mean both things, but certainly that's it's a differentiation that should be called out. You may be using them in a different way. So I'm going to presume going forward that you just mean like the means of production and not like my toothbrush.
Yeah, absolutely. Because obviously, any system that does not secure the rights to personal toothbrush ownership by all is a truly unjust one, as I'm sure we can agree.
I can, but I do want to point out though that there's a very problematic issue about what defines use. Right? I mean, it's very convenient to say, oh, well, the stuff you use is personal property, the stuff you don't use is private property, but what does use mean? Right? So that's
well, yeah, I think it is. It is inevitably going to be subjective. I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that.
I don't think it's inevitably subjective at all, and the heroic ethic draws sharp lines in that respect. But anyway, carry on.
I would be very skeptical that you can draw hard lines on something as nuanced and as specific as the very fuzzy line between personal and private. There's
that's
like
why I don't think you can distinguish. That's why to me it's all the same.
Gotcha. Okay.
So.
Yeah, I understand I think we're coming at this from very different perspectives.
You say force, but if you try to take my toothbrush, I'm going to stop you with force. The fact that you don't want to doesn't to me make it any categorically different.
No, don't get me wrong. I don't mean force in any kind of morally loaded term. I'm just saying, if someone steals from you, either you or the state has the right to, take it back by force. That's how that goes.
Well, I agree with the you part. The state part, I don't agree with the state. So they have.
Same here.
But my proxies, because in a free society, I would certainly have a law, agency at my disposal that has a security force. So yeah, if you steal my wallet, people with guns will be coming after you. It's just they won't be, state police.
My main concern with that is that I really don't see how that is all that different from a state. Because, okay, from an anarchist perspective, the state is the monopoly on legitimized force, right? It is, this group is allowed to imprison you, to kill you, to arrest you, whatever, right? And that's not illegal for them. I can't imprison some guy for breaking the law and throw him in my basement. But the government can, the state can, right?
Well, this is a great segue, so just give me a couple of minutes to talk here, because this comes up over and over in conversation. People are like, how could that possibly work? And this theory was laid out by David Friedman in his seminal work, The Machinery of Freedom. This is a must-read, I think, to anyone who describes himself as a libertarian, because he describes how all of this stuff would work. And so, just very basically, what would happen is that there would be a competing market, sector for law enforcement, just like for burgers or chicken fingers or whatever. And you would choose whichever one you like. And so what would happen is if you choose to say, let's just say, I think you steal my wallet, right? So I go to my law agency and I say, hey, this dude stole my wallet. And then they say, well, you just expect us to go on your word on this, or do you maybe have some evidence to support this claim? And I'm like, well, yeah, I have a video. And it sees him going through my pants and taking my wallet. And so they're like, okay, well, that seems reasonable. We're going to go arrest this guy. So they take their guns, just private citizens, but they take their guns and they go arrest you, right? Mm-hmm. And then you say, that wasn't me. I have a twin brother who's evil and he just keeps, ruining my reputation. That wasn't me. And then so you go to another private agency, or maybe the same one, but let's just say a different one for sake of argument. And you say, look, I'm being falsely accused, I'm being held in jail, and they think I stole this wallet, but it's really not me. And you expect us to just take your word on this, or do you have some evidence? And then you'd be like, oh yeah, I was at dinner at this, during the time, and my brother, he has a record of like doing this stuff. And they're like, oh, okay, well, that seems reasonable. We'll take up your defense. And then these two agencies are going to work it out. They're going to be like, well, here's my evidence, here's your evidence. Can we figure this out? If it's the same agency, they do it internally. But if they can't come to agreement, then they kick it up to an arbitrator whose entire purpose in this whole, McDonald's type version of the law is to settle these disputes. And in fact, because these are like companies that can forecast and understand how business works, they've got pre-existing agreements that anytime agency B and agency C have an issue, then they kick it up to arbitrator Z, right? So all of this stuff would be, worked out, and I can't say how, just like I can't forecast what the, 0-point energy sector is going to be like 50 years from now, because, it's just beyond the powers of a human being. But I can be assured that because entrepreneurs are trying to realize profits, and they're doing so in a competitive environment where they're punished for making mistakes, and where they have to use their own capital, right? Because of course the immediate rejection to this, or objection to this, is like, oh, but they're just going to start wars, and they're private citizens, they have no check on making war on each other. And my response to that is, one, it's McDonald's could go firebomb Burger King. That's a pretty silly way of doing business. It's not going to get them very far in the long run. And then two, wars are expensive. If you're a state and you can tax and you can conscript and you can inflate the money supply, you love wars. But if you're a private company using your own capital and trying to convince people to work for you that don't want to throw their lives away because they've got families, so they're not going to be like, hell no, I'm not conducting an attack on Burger King. Are you fucking crazy? So I think a lot of these fears are just, misplaced and occur because people just don't really understand how markets work. So yeah, all right, that was a long freaking aside for the sake of the viewer.
Yeah, okay. So got a couple things. My first is, and I guess my primary concern is that I'm really not sure how this is all that different from the power structures that would exist in a normal society, in a state society. I'm not sure how it really changes all that much whether the police force, as it were private companies or were state conscripted, because either way you're having a situation wherein there are some people who have the legitimized use of violence, either through they have this capital and they're allowed to do that because they are official.
That's where you get wrong. Every person has the right of violence. If you attack me in my home, I have every right to take you down. What I'm doing is I'm extending it through proxy to expand my power so that I can actually do so effectively, right? If you steal my wallet, right, what am I going to do? Show up and arrest you personally or get my friends together? I mean, no, that doesn't work. I hire people for that. Just like I don't make my own shoes. I hire people for that.
Oh, no, absolutely. But you do still see how in a system like that, there are people, in this case, the proxy private police force, who would have a more legitimate use of force in the sense of being able to arrest people who have a more...
It's not more legitimate because you're thinking in terms of a state, which is like an ultimate monopolized system to which there's no recourse. In a private system, if agency A starts acting in an abusive manner, guess what? There's agencies B, C, D, and E, and then A is going to lose all their customers as they go over to B, C, and D, because it's like, I'm not sticking with A. They freaking came and took my kids because someone told them my refrigerator didn't have enough food in it. Screw them, right? The state can do that because they have a monopoly. Private companies can't do that because they're trying to compete with others and stay in the black. If you are a private company, you go into the red, you go out of business. The state goes into the red, they just tax more.
I question how you can not have monopolies in a system like that, because in a free market, in a profit motive enterprise, where I assume since you care about property rights, you're allowing for the buying and selling of property to others, I'm genuinely unsure as to how you can not have monopolies, because in a system like that, and to get into some more Marxist stuff where you have, the owners who accumulate wealth through their ownership, it goes bottom up. I'm not sure how you can have a system wherein capital, and therefore in this system power, would not consolidate at the top.
Okay, so this is an economic issue that is very contentious. I take the side that you cannot have natural monopolies, because a true monopoly can only manifest through the power of the state using their guns to say, this is the monopoly, and anybody else that tries to compete with it gets thrown in jail or shot in the most extreme scenario. Whereas in a free market, there is no such force to enable that monopoly, and then any monopoly is immediately subject to competition. I mean, if you look at the Forbes 500 from 100 years ago, you're not going to recognize almost any of those companies, because the natural churn of the economy is that when companies get too big, they become slow to respond, and then smaller companies targeting smaller niches just satisfy consumer demand better, and they start stealing customers with better prices, with better products. And so typically a monopoly has to go to the state and be like, oh, these guys are killing us in competition, shut them down. But there's no such recourse in a market, so there are no monopolies, right? This idea that a natural monopoly is going to occur in a free market scenario, I just have to assert is plain wrong.
Yeah, okay, so I have two things here. The first is that I'm really not sure. So, especially because you said that, for example, these companies may have official dealings with arbitrators. They may have pre-existing contracts written. That would significantly bias things towards the bigger ones who would already have these roads in place with arbitrators and with some of the better paying private people who may
first
be
to market and more capital is an advantage.
Yes,
It's one that historically is overcome all the time and inevitably, but it is an advantage, yes.
Yeah, so my main concern then is that I really think you are underestimating to what extent, especially in a system like this, that capital can act as power just as much as a state can. It may not be as immediately legitimate, but it can have the same effect on the amount of power it grants someone with access to vastly more amounts of it.
That is true, and if you'll bear with me, I think this is a great opportunity to segue for the point of the viewers to explain yet another difference between our two perspectives, which is that we call ourselves libertarian because we agree that hierarchy is bad when it comes to the state. The anarcho-socialists, or the left or whatever, they go further and are opposed to hierarchies even at the worker-employer level. Right, I think that's kind of like the main thing. Now, actually, does that extend to the family level with you guys? I know that does with Marxists and some of the more extreme romantics.
Some 12-year-olds on Twitter will say that the family is an unjust hierarchy. I think most people probably don't believe that.
Well, okay, so I will point out that if you do believe that the family is a legitimate hierarchy, but that the work-employer one is not, that you need to explain that. Because
sure.
It's just an arbitrary distinction, then why to me it seems like on the surface, if it's consistent, it should be, the same for both.
I think the best argument for this does probably come from Chomsky, where he says that the hierarchy in place between a parent and a child has the explicit and obvious socially defined goal of keeping the child safe when they are unable to do so themselves, whereas workers are, grown adults who are plenty capable of being democratic in their own respect, and to which the bourgeois owner really only seems to exist in order to extract the surplus value.
So that's an interesting one that I would like to ask you to explain for the viewers. One of the key ways that this whole libertarian socialist thing works is through democracy. They have a very high respect for democracy, far higher than it deserves, in my opinion. Democracy is mob rule. It's two wolves in a sheep voting on what's for dinner. But the way that they expect everything to work is through voting, through democracy. So, for example, just to talk about the whole worker-employer relation, to a capitalist, it's like, okay, the employer takes the risk to accumulate the capital and then puts it all on the line mostly probably to go out of business, but the ones that succeed are able to then hire people who voluntarily are willing to exchange the lack of responsibility and their time and labor in exchange for a wage. And we think that's perfectly legitimate because that's like a voluntary association. Whereas the left tends to prefer these worker cooperatives where basically everyone votes and everyone is like not just a guy who screws the cap onto the toothpaste tube. He is also a management guy who is expected to be able to vote responsibly on all of these higher level management stuff like mergers and all of that. So please explain to me how like democracy is supposed to work that way. I mean, is this some kind of magic perfect information system where like
no, absolutely, but I don't
vote on everything? And then two, I mean, that's one, like the logistics. How the hell does that even happen? And then two, what about Winston Churchill's famous maxim, which is that the greatest argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with your average voter, right? I mean, they're just not capable of doing these things. So one, logistically it's impossible, and two, psychologically it's impossible, as I see it. Please explain why.
Yeah, sure. So I at the very least appreciate that you're upfront with your skepticism with democracy. I see a lot of ANCAPs who are like, well, actually this is the most democratic system because you vote with your dollar. I appreciate at least the sort of stuff there.
There's a lot of bad thinkers in my side of things too.
It's an inevitability. So first of all, in terms of the immediate logistics, so we got to talk about, first of all, I guess, why I even see this as necessarily a bad thing. So you said it's a voluntary association, that you got the owners who have the capital and who risk it in owning, and then the workers who have their relatively guaranteed payment. So first of all, I would just like to say the argument from that the owners gamble stuff is not necessarily the case. What we find often is that when exceptionally poor decisions are made on the management front, it's not really the owners who are punished for it. It's really more like they just lay off a bunch of workers and then have their own severance packages. So I would be concerned that the gambling is really on that level. Now, if we're talking just about small businesses, I can agree with you there. And I have significantly less problem with small businesses on that.
At this point, I would like to differentiate because I guess my argumentation has take maybe the side of big business, and I want to emphasize that's not the case, because as I see it, businesses and corporations, these vast mega corporations that just control like all the media and like all the production, would never occur on a free market. They are only able to achieve this size through them leveraging the government guns and crippling their potential competitors through favorable regulation, through laws, through heavy taxation, which just cripples like the small burgeoning business, but which of course a mega corporation can deal with no problem. So like I am not on board with supporting like these mega corporations by any means. I do think that there's a middle ground that's hard to see between like the guy running your corner bodega, who's obviously a small businessman, versus Jeff Bezos. And I think it's hard to see them because they don't really appear on the market as we see them now. They would appear in a truly free market where these mega corporations just couldn't exist because they don't have their partner in crime, the government, to debilitate their competitors. So just a distinction that I think is important.
Yeah, I guess on that respect, I'm really not convinced that, again, in a free market system wherein, from, again, more of a Marxist perspective, through the ownership, value flows upward, right? You have the people who own, who necessarily through capitalism are taking the excess value generated by those below them through their ownership. They will inevitably, through this kind of system, come up with a disproportionate amount of wealth that will, I assume, snowball. I'm not sure the specific economic stuff you're referring to in terms of the state. I just don't see how a system like that can prevent. I guess from your perspective, it's not so much prevent as it would never happen in the first place. It wouldn't need to be prevented. But I'm not sure how that wealth would not be consolidated. In fact, even more so under a system where money can just flow freely.
Because labor can also price itself, because there is a demand for labor, and so they're able to price themselves. And in a free market without all of these distortions introduced by the state, it ultimately finds the market value. Now, as an aside, we don't live in a perfectly equilibrium state, what Mises called the evenly rotating economy. That's just like an abstraction. We're never actually at it. So there's never actually a market price, right? Like actually each price is an individual transaction between like the guy selling and the guy buying. And so, right, the market price is just like where the market clears, right? It doesn't really describe any particular interaction. And so in this environment, where people have capital and have invested in creating capital and then magnifying the overall production by marrying it to the marginal productivity of labor, the labor can demand higher wages. And if they don't get the higher wages from this company, they're going to go to this competitor that actually exists, right? It doesn't exist in this market because the government uses guns to prevent it from existing. But in the free market, it does exist, and then they go, because the entrepreneur is always about, well, I can sell X units and generate Y revenue, which is Z profit, and then I can do, A wages and still have good profits. And in a competitive environment where they're if I don't pay my people enough, then right, this other company's going to steal them away. So even though labor is by far the greatest cost in any business, I've got to give these guys more. And
we really don't see that happening. Is my thing. So
because we don't live in a free market. We have all of these. You can't go to this non-existent.
Okay, nothing we have is preventing that. Nothing in our existing labor laws is preventing this kind of, worker pricing, and yet it still doesn't seem to happen.
No, I just said, though, in this environment, there's all these companies that don't exist, right? And so therefore, you can't go to them if they don't exist.
But how can you be sure that they will exist is my thing. Okay, so to what extent, let's look at, we have something like China, where even though all the wages are terrible, people continue, certain parts of China, with the, factory workers, all the wages there are uniformly terrible because everyone kind of collectively realized, oh shit, they kind of have no minimum wage. We can just, offload all our work there.
What does terrible mean?
What?
You said their wages are terrible. What does terrible mean?
I think literally less than $1 an hour.
Is it better than their alternatives? Are there alternatives whoring as a preteen or working 16 hours a day in a drug factory?
Why limit yourself to a system that only exists? Okay.
It's better. They're on a progression where they're ultimately going to be as rich as us, where every poor person is obese with an iPhone and wearing Jordans. They're not there yet, though. But that is what takes a society along that path. We traverse that path. I mean, people are not aware of how horrific the living conditions were before the Industrial Revolution, right? And when the Industrial Revolution came around, we now look back and we say, oh, they worked for terrible wages, their children, but at the time, they were like, I'm starving, my family is starving. They would literally eat a bowl of cabbage soup every other day. That was the average living standard. And then a company comes along and they're like, you're going to pay me a penny a day? That's like room and board for a week. Are you fucking kidding me? My wife will help half wages. Totally fine. My kid, quarter wages. I got 6 kids. Is that cool? Right? That's the perspective that they're coming from. And it's so easy for us to look back and be like, ugh, horrible wages. I think we make that same mistake when we look at slave, or sweatshops. It's bad by our standards, but what is their alternative?
Okay, but why limit yourself to their standards? Why are we only looking at the standards of them, whereas we have the entire world with which to compare with? I'm
glad you asked, because this gets to a core difference, and one that ultimately I'm going to ask a question of you about, sure. Which is that, again, I come to this having learned economics first. And so I have a particular understanding of how the pie grows and how this capital and wealth and standards of living grow. And it involves saving by consuming less than you produce, and then using it to create capital, which magnifies, productivity overall. So the pie goes through this process of entrepreneurs seeing ways to better serve the consumers, taking the risks of accumulating the capital, and then gambling that their analysis of consumer desires was correct. The market rewards or punishes them. And that's how new products and new companies come to market. The problem that I see with the left is that they often, and especially with this worker and employer relationship that they criticize, they favor like these worker collectives that where everybody owns the factory and everybody like makes decisions. How did that factory come into being? And what happens when that factory goes out of business like most factories do? Right? That insulation from risk is the very value of taking on a wage. Because if my company goes out of business and I'm a wage guy, I go from McDonald's to Burger King. But if I own this factory, and if I own this McDonald's franchise and it goes out of business, what the hell do I do now? Am I going to go to some other collective where they all own it and they're just going to be like, yeah, sure, come in and dilute my ownership share. We don't even really need you, but this isn't about making money or supporting my family. This is about being a nice guy.
The same question
I've never
could be
seen
said.
really any theory or any explanation from your side of this.
Well,
How do companies form? When they go out of business, what happens to those people?
The same thing could be said of your system. Why hire this new guy if you don't necessarily need it?
Because he doesn't dilute your ownership share. That's the thing. If
but
Elon Musk builds a Tesla, why should he hire a janitor that's going to get an ownership share?
Because their value given to the company will in turn increase the value proportional. I mean, that's how that works. You hire people.
A janitor is a wage job, and I'm sorry.
People want janitors. I mean,
yes, but the thing is that if this janitor refuses to work at less than $30 an hour, my kid will do it for $15.
It wouldn't be through wages. It would be through collective ownership. So it would be whatever proportion of the company that they decide is worth. So if they say,
why would you ever do that? It's just a janitor, right? This idea that you don't need to make money, the idea that you're not a business, the idea that you're not a business where your income or your revenues have to exceed your costs. It doesn't make any sense to me. You can't just
why
pay
do you hire
janitor
janitors in a capitalist system?
because they're worth their productivity. Because if I'm paying them $15 an hour, that means they're giving me back 20. But if if they're giving me 20 and they get an ownership share that's worth 30, why would no one would ever hire the janitor?
You would negotiate that. It would be relative to their value. So if I don't know
why is that better? If it's exact same value as a wage, why is that better? It just means he can shirk and not do a good job, and then you can't fire him because he owns the place.
Well, anyone. It's collective ownership.
Not anyone.
So
if it's a shirking janitor, you can fire him. If it's a shirking janitor who owns the place, you can't fire him.
On him. Wait, no, you could vote. You could say, hey, this guy's not doing his job. Let's fucking get rid of this guy.
So it's a matter of how many likes he has on Instagram, whether he gets fired, and not whether my toilets are clean. That doesn't seem to be a very good system.
What are you referring to? No, I'm
You
saying...
just said that they were going to vote on the janitor being fired or not. If he's got a lot of friends...
The employees of the company.
And if he has a lot of friends in an employee environment where, guess what? People make friends and cliques develop, and he's just the most popular janitor of all time.
In a capitalist system, all that matters is if you're friends with the boss. You can get away with a lot of shit if you're friends with the boss and he likes you enough that he's willing to overlook that. It's a lot easier to do that.
That, I would say, is pretty rare. I mean, certainly there are positions earned by nepotism, but that's not how the system is generalized. And this is a great point to make. There's no perfect system. Any system that I advocate is what I think is the best system that human beings can pull off, given that human beings are self-interested, that they have imperfect information, that they're tribal.
Wait, so hold on. You just said that humans were self-interested and would do things for their own profit motive, and now you're saying they wouldn't fire a guy who isn't doing his job, even though he's taking away from their share of the pie?
Yes, because people value an individual for much more than their economic output. They do it because they like him, because of the social and emotional value that he brings, and you can't run a company on likes. Companies have to have more revenue than their
why
costs.
I'm saying people wouldn't do that, but you could say the same thing about a boss. A boss is a person, and therefore could be biased towards this guy just as much as the collective could be, but it's probably way easier to convince one boss that, you're worth not being fired over than it is to convince everyone who's seeing that you're, in this case, basically elite. You're not doing your job that you were hired for.
Yeah, but every person is limited by what's called Dunbar's number. We can only know and have personal relationships with about 150 people. So a company has way more than 150 employees, so only a couple of them can cozy up to the boss. But when it comes to shirking employees, they got lots of friends, bro.
Anytime a company gets big enough, I would say it's probably better to move to some sort of representative system. You elect managers. You can maybe elect the CEO if it ever comes to that. But anything, you elect a manager that represents your branch. Let's say.
You never did actually address my criticism that this person it's not your fault. I mean, these conversations go all over the place. Just bringing it back around, an employee who is, first of all, let's remember that half of people are under average IQ. So, and the ones that are under average are probably the ones that are in the more the labor jobs. So this guy with a substandard IQ who barely knows how to sling a mop and is still learning the nuances of how to wax a deck is supposed to vote on management decisions? How is that supposed to work?
Sure. So a pretty cool. I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent, but you'll see how it's relevant.
Please, yeah, by all means. I go on these all the time, so don't hesitate to take up 5 minutes or whatever.
For a long while, it was thought that the only way that we could govern systems is if we get the really smart blood people to do it, and they would have kids, and those kids would be raised to be the new rulers, and that was how it would be done. And then some liberal thinkers came along, and they said, hey, wait a second, I actually think these peasantry should be allowed and should be able to, if given the right educational opportunities, to govern themselves through democracy. That was the Enlightenment. That was the liberal hegemony change from the monarchy. And then we had, the French Revolution. We had a lot of anti-monarchy revolutions, and people were like, well, wait a second, these people can't govern themselves. They're super uneducated. They're a bunch of, impoverished, poor people. We should keep the monarchy, who are raised from birth to govern people. And yet, we did it anyway, and now I'd say we're pretty well off for it. So we have gone from a system wherein you just have this one lineage that's in charge of making all the decisions, who's supposedly perfectly qualified from birth, to now having some amount of democracy. Obviously, we could have more, but we're not perfect as is. And we've done pretty well for ourselves in response to that. So it's the same thing with the workplace, where I see a lot of people say that, well, they're a bunch of workers, they can't govern themselves. Well, I don't know. I mean, a bunch of peasants supposedly couldn't govern themselves, and we gave them education. We gave them the tools needed to govern themselves, and in turn, we created, America. I'm sure you're a decent fan of that one. We got a lot of really great democracy out of it. And for someone like Marx, who would then say, hey, I love the whole liberty, equality, freedom thing. I'm not sure you really fulfilled that. Let's do something that's even more that. That's how you get to more of a socialism system, where you say, hey, I love the whole democracy part. I love that you can, educate people and get them to be able to govern themselves. I think we should be able to do that in the workplace too. If we educate these people and we give them the tools needed to be democratic and to govern themselves. That's my argument.
Okay, thank you for that. My response is that I think that is overly optimistic, because what you're doing is you're taking very broad, extremely large, generalized examples like the French Revolution and, I presume, the American Revolution, and trying to apply them to making a business stay in the black. It just doesn't work that way. You can have this kind of romantic language about, the huddle masses and, yearning to be free and, taking care of everybody at this general conversational level. But when it comes to running a business, when it comes to staying in the black, and in the face of all of these competitors who are trying to steal your customers with better ideas and better hours and better marketing, you can't run it on likes. It has to be, is this guy worth $15 an hour? Because if not, we got to fire him. And it's just like, man, I tried to run a food truck once, and if I hired a worker, which mostly I couldn't afford, and that's why I was working 14-hour days myself. I mean, just this idea that I could pay him some kind of arbitrarily decide amount, it just means that I don't hire that guy. And so, again, I come to this from the economics first, and the idea that you can just, that, oh yeah, the janitor making business decisions, that's just going to work out because look at America. America's all about romantic. That's not a very good argument to me. I'm sorry. That's my initial response.
I don't know. It depends, because I've got plenty of I've done plenty of research that worker co-ops do succeed in economic departments. If that's what you look at, I can find stuff on that.
That actually is a great point that I wanted to ask you about. So in a free market, you guys are welcome to do that. You're welcome to create a worker co-op and all of that, and then see how well it competes against guys, hiring people at wage. Why don't you? And two, in an environment, because this is something that you mentioned in our run-up to this. You didn't like how when people invoke socialism, they invoke authoritarianism. How does that not follow, though? Because if in a voluntary environment, me and my friends choose to not join your co-op, we choose to work for wage because we think we're better off that way. Maybe we get tips or whatever, and we don't want to join your collective. What happens when you can't compete with us? That's why I think authoritarianism and socialism are hand in hand, because the ultimate answer is we've got to force them into the system. If we don't force them into the system, they're going to just ruin everything, because they're going to basically outcompete us, and they're not going to choose the system that we want, right? You can do that anyway, but those types of systems are non-competitive. That's why you don't see any of them. So you want to force us into this system where everyone is has to do the substandard thing, but how? How do you do that in a voluntary society?
Yeah, so I do think there is an inevitable amount of, hey, we got to make this happen. But I would argue that's entirely justifiable, in the same way that I would say that it is, technically speaking, an authoritarian overreach of state power in terms of property rights to free the slaves. Wait,
let me just get this straight. You just said that it was acceptable to force people into your socialist system because the state does it anyway?
I'm saying that in the same way that it was, if we want to use this terminology, a state overreach on private property rights to free slaves when they were legally considered owned. Because we decided,
I don't endorse that position at all. Let me just.
Of course, I don't expect you to. I'm just saying, in the same way that our values changed, we said, hey, we don't think this should be a thing that you can own. In this case, it was people. We're going to say you're not allowed to own.
As an aside, I'm so sorry. I'm so bad with these, but otherwise I'll forget. Do you really think that slavery, which has been with humanity for thousands of years, just magically went away because our morals changed?
No, of course not. What I'm saying is that over
time...
time...
What do you think changed? Because you say, of course not now, but a minute ago you just said morals changed and we eliminated slavery. So... It's
obviously overly broad, but what I'm saying is that in something like America...
Okay, just let me get this out, because what I'm saying is that what actually happened was that slavery became uneconomic. It was economic for thousands of years, but as soon as we had the Industrial Revolution and wages became an option, all of a sudden it became like slaves shirk, slaves are expensive, slaves, like, you have to upkeep them. Wages, you pay them a wage. That's like so much better. That's why all of a sudden people magically realize, hey, wait a minute. Now that we don't personally benefit from slavery, we can see that it's immoral. Holy shit. It wasn't any kind of like moral enlightenment.
We did the Civil War before the Industrial Revolution.
The Industrial Revolution was in the late 1600s in Britain and in the late 1700s in the United States. So it was like 100 years before the
slaves were still. My apologies. Slaves were still plenty profitable.
All the slaves of England were freed. The serfs of Russia, they were emancipated in 1864. Right, like all of this is happening at the same time for a reason. disparate societies, disparate economic systems, all gave up slavery and serfdom for the same reason. It was economic. But in any case, sorry, I keep going.
Okay, so we did the Civil War over this. It was clearly, something people wanted to keep enough that they were willing to fight a war over it, and they lost, and the slaves were freed. And what I'm saying is that we said, we did the 13th Amendment. We said, you're not allowed to own these anymore. It doesn't matter about the profitability of it, because if it was just the profitability argument, then we wouldn't have even done the 13th Amendment. We would have said, oh, well, it doesn't matter. They're unprofitable, so it doesn't even really matter whether or not they're legal. We just know no one's going to do this anymore. Whereas we didn't. That wasn't what happened. We did the legal thing. We said, you're not allowed to own these anymore. We don't care. The profitability is not relevant. What is relevant is that we do not think it is moral for you to be able to own these people anymore. And if you want to go with the purely economic argument, that's fine. But I would say that's really worrying for your side if you're saying that the only thing stopping slavery from happening is that it's unprofitable. If you want to live in a system where people are doing the value analysis on if it's profitable to own black people anymore, I suppose it would be race neutral in your system. That's fine, but I think that would be an extremely dangerous system to advocate for if the only thing stopping...
I'm not advocating for this system. I'm saying that this is the system whether we like it or not, and that we need to advocate policies that are in accordance with this system. I don't like it that it took 6,000 years for us to figure out that slavery was bad. Although actually, as an aside, slavery is a kind of a humane step up from what they did before, which was kill every single person. It is...
Yeah, the Rome stuff, right? One of the big reasons why Rome could get so big was that instead of just killing all their enemies, they would enslave them.
Dude, the shit they did to Carthage is freaking brutal, man. People should look that shit up. Carthage did not fare well in their encounter with the Roman Empire. But yeah, that's how they used to do it. But look, I'm not here sanctioning slavery. I'm just saying it's unfortunate, and it's actually super awesome. And one of the reasons that I'm a huge advocate of capitalism was that it was able to create a system that slavery was uneconomic. And then we were able to make this huge moral advance where literally 200 years ago, man, it was legal. This shit was legal a few generations ago. Because we are humans and we do that, man. We sanction moral relativity, we create outgroups, we create others, and then we demonize them, and then we justify enslaving them. And capitalism was something that allowed us to take a huge step forward, man. Huge step forward. So that's one of the reasons that I will always advocate for true capitalism, and I realize here whenever I say capitalism, I need to define that I don't mean what we see all around us, which is not capitalism, right? The government controls the money, controls all of the different business sectors with regulations and taxation and all of that. This is not a free market, not capitalism. I don't endorse this. I hate the society around us. At least we can agree on that, I'm sure.
So, okay, if the argument you're getting to is that it just sort of happened, it was made it was made unprofitable through the Industrial Revolution to have slaves, and then people, as a motivated reasoning, were then oh, okay, well, I guess this is also immoral now. If that's the argument you're getting at, which as I understand it is...
the moral arguments were almost never a factor, right? We remember them because the abolitionists who pushed them forward, wrote shit, and we have that to remember by, and that really skews our perspective. They were nobodies. They were dust. They were, nobody was an abolitionist back then. Get the fuck out. People were, slavery is good, or they didn't think about it too much. In the North, first of all, there's a lot of fucking slaves in the North too, but they just didn't think about it too much because it was the entire system on. Just like we don't think too much about, and I don't want to get too controversial. A lot of things about our own society we don't think about too much, and we just accept them. That 500 years from now, people are gonna be like, "Can you believe that shit? Oh my God, those people were backwards."
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And my argument is the same thing could be said. Because, you brought it up yourself. We don't know necessarily ourselves what is and is not going to be considered immoral of our current society a few hundred years in the future. So, to me, something like having ownership over someone else's labor, wage slavery exists. It's a flammable...
How do they own my labor if I can quit?
What?
How do they own my labor if I can quit?
Oh, if we want to get into this argument, absolutely we can. So let's say, for example, that you and someone else are on a plane and you crash onto a deserted island, right? And on this island,
I love these thought experiments, by the way. Go on.
Absolutely. This one's gotten some renown. You're on a deserted island with just you and your friend, and there are a couple food stores. Let's say there's, some wood from some trees that you can use to make fishing rods. There's some coconut trees that you can harvest. And let's say that you were out for a bit longer than him, right? And in the meanwhile, while you were out, he has taken ownership over all of the things. You got your coconuts. He's put them in a pile. You got the fishing rods. He's crafted a couple of those, and he's got them out to work. And he says, "All right, hey, listen, I own all this stuff now because that's how that be." And let's say, just for the sake of argument, he's significantly physically stronger than you. He says, "Hey, I'll feed you. I got you. I do own this, but I will feed you as long as you can provide your worth in labor. So how about you, I don't know, do some sexual favors for me?" Would you not say that that is a very coercive system?
Well, yeah, but the whole thing keys on the fact that the dude is bigger and is able to and willing to use force. I mean,
well,
I don't think that makes much sense.
What I'm saying is that that's an inevitable part of any system that allows for this ownership to pool up, where you have companies that will be bigger than any one individual can ever be, and maybe even bigger than several individuals can ever be. I'd say Amazon is probably bigger than some companies at this point, even if you want to say that such a large corporation could never exist in your system. You have these situations where the method, because in a capitalist system, obviously, inevitably, most people will have to work, right? There will be a few owners, most people are workers, just sort of how the math works on that one. So you have a system wherein most people need to work, and they need to work for people who definitionally own more than they do and are profiting off of their labor. So even though they can quit, they're still in a coercive system wherein they need to work for someone. It's got to be someone, and it's got to be someone who will be under this capitalist system. And
so going back to your example, what you're basically now doing is adding a third person to the island. And if there's a third person, then he and I can gang up on the other guy. That's my answer, because that's exactly what would happen in a regular society. We force multiply our personal power by engaging others, right?
If you want to talk about like unionization, I'm all for that.
Well, it's not so much that; it's that I can go to a proxy and ask them to employ force against this superior force, and you say that they have more property, more money, but once you get to a certain level, that doesn't matter, right? Their added power and stuff just means they're in like different cities or whatever. Like when you're talking about like on the ground, you can only have so many guns in your hand, and so they just can't overpower an individual who also has the power to engage others. They would just gang up.
It would be a lot of individuals. If you're talking about a system wherein private companies can be hired for defense work, someone with more money can hire more private contractors to defend themselves from you, who is one person who has less money for less.
Only to a certain point. Like I said, once you get to a certain level, you can only have so many guns on the ground. And poor people, sure, rich have Neiman Marcus and Tiffany's, but the poor have Walmart and Amazon and McDonald's.
Well,
you really think that those companies don't have power?
The poor don't own those. The poor don't own those. Rich people own those.
You don't have to own them. You would hire them. They can only exist because they have customers. Again, this is an environment where you don't get to have companies that exist because the government points guns at everyone who might compete with them. They have to.
Okay, I see. So you mean like as in the equivalent of like the Mick Army versus the Tiffany's Army?
Yeah,
I see what
exactly.
you're kind of.
Tiffany's being bigger just means they're also in San Francisco, but who gives a shit? We're in New York. You can only have
they would have access
guns
to higher quality weaponry if that's what you're getting at. Any system that's sort of this free market thing would have the delineation of quality to money put in.
obviously the
yes,
niche
but
for
that
something.
said, I'm not advocating. This is what I call the argument against perfection. Right now, you're just saying, well, that's just, your system's not perfect because this, that, and the other thing.
I'm not
like,
saying
I never
your
said
system
it
isn't
was.
perfect.
I'm saying it's
saying
better
your
than the
system
alternative of a monopolized system. That, I mean, because, dude, I'm sorry, but democracy in any kind of organization, even in a small workplace environment, there's going to be elites. There's going to be people who are just, Bill Clintons and Barack Obamas who are just like so charismatic and so good at like organizing. They're going to get the power because guess what? People want power. And then they see a lot of people like you and me look at this like, oh, this is going to be a worker collective because like we're all chipping in, we're all getting, compensated for our value and all of that. But I promise you, there's sociopaths that are going to be like, I see a system ripe for conquest, and I'm going to go in, and I've got like all, I can't use government guns, but I can use my charisma, and then, oh, this guy, I don't like him, so I'm just going to get my little clique of mean girls to fucking destroy him socially, and then he's got to, then he's humiliated, and he's got to, now I can blackmail him, or now he's got to quit. I mean, it seems like one runs afoul of human nature. I don't see how democracies are going to work in any kind of thing where staying out of the red and being in the black makes matters.
Two things here. So for one, and if you're going with, I guess we'll call it like the sociopath argument. How do you stop people who are just in it for their own gain from being in it for their own gain? I would say that's pretty much a problem with any system. I mean, any system will inevitably have ways by which people can consolidate power. My system offers
that was why the American system wasn't a democracy, right? It was actually all about checks and balances on democracy.
Sure. Checks and balances are cool. I have nothing against, like, for example, a constitution. With something like a workplace democracy, it's a lot less harmful to be the guy who's very charismatic and maybe gets elected to a representative position than it is to be, like, the CEO who can, like, has all of his employees as pawns or whatever, like that. If you're talking about just someone who will, through their charisma, gain power and go up the ranks, a system wherein that person can eventually own the company will have significantly more unchecked power than someone who, at the end of the day, is only as powerful as he can get people to like him.
Well, but that person though also has to answer to the bottom line. If the company is in the red under his leadership, people are going to get rid of him because they're going to lose all their jobs. So it's not just a matter of like how much people like him, right? I mean, I know you keep coming back to that example of the janitor is going to make friends with the boss, but the boss, he can't run the company on likes.
I promise you, if you look into examples, there are going to be tons of people who are around just because of nepotism. It's not all...
I agree, 100%. I mean, dude, I should, by the way, I'm like a huge failure when it comes to like making money. I mean, I'm 50 years old and I have an Ivy League degree, so you would think that I would make money, but I've spent most of my career like working as a waiter, admittedly in Michelin star restaurants for a pretty good wage, but and I have like nothing right now, so like I'm poor as shit. Like these are my people.
One of us thinks that should be a relatively respectable position because you're still doing societally valuable labor. I'll let you.
Well, see, that's the thing, though. Like, I actually look at my current system and my approach. I'm on YouTube, and I'm like committed to trying to make this into an income. I know I will. It's just a matter of doing it long enough because growth is inevitable. And I don't have any bosses. I don't have to call anyone or answer to anybody. And I don't see why that was not an option in the first place. Entrepreneurship. I tried to do a food truck. I mean, you don't have to work for a wage. You can create like a small business yourself. If you, it's just, and we're gonna have to wrap this up because this is gonna be getting, on the lengthy side. But I don't see how you can marry on the one hand a voluntary system with an economic system that is suboptimal and then therefore needs to force people into it. Because if they were, you can say, oh, well, I can point to all these examples. I'd be like, well, show me the competitive ones. Show me like why 99.999% of successful businesses don't do that.
Yeah, I can absolutely link you studies on the economic side of worker cooperatives. To the best of my knowledge, I know the immediate stuff is that they are significantly better at resisting price shocks, and they're significantly more likely to succeed within the first 5 years, where most companies tend to fail.
Did you hear about the experiment about that dude who decided he was just going to pay everybody in his company $70,000 a year?
No, I didn't.
oh, it's cool, from a couple of years ago. Maybe I'll add that link to the description of this video. He is just like a couple years ago. He was like, oh, I'm successful. I read this article about a study that says that $70,000 is like the base. So anyway, yeah, this guy just decided to pay everybody $70,000. And he was out of business a year later. And first, all of his people quit. Because they were all like, why should I'm a VP. And I'm getting paid the same as the janitor? Fuck you. And they quit.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is sort
out
of
of business that way. And that said, that's a big world, lots of examples. I'm sure you can point to an outlier or two. Well, this company is, not out of business yet. And
I'm not referring to outliers. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying from what I've seen from the collective data of worker cooperatives that exist, these seem to be significantly more successful in certain key areas.
Well, that would be interesting grist for the mill for a following discussion. Because we are going to have to wrap this up. It's a little bit over an hour, and I feel like that's probably as much as people are going to want to watch in one sitting, though. But I'm going to review it. I will make notes, and I will send you those notes. And I would love to have another conversation with you, man. This has been a really reasonable, value-add information exchange discussion that I like to have, that didn't get bogged down in, tone of voice and things like that, which is just always such a pleasure. So, any last comments before I wrap this up?
No, I believe that was all. I genuinely appreciate talking to you. Had a good time. I hope you did as well. I'm curious to see how this goes down.
Okay, but hey, do me a favor for the next one, man. You got to choose a hero name. It's like my
that is true. I do need to choose a hero name.
You got to have a hero name. So awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Shand. And I'll probably do, I guess, an outro for the video. But if I don't, this has been The Heroic Ethic. I'm your host, Liberty Bill. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.
Bye.